the heart of a bustling city, a 4-year-old girl spends every night alone in the park, hiding from a world that doesn't care. When a compassionate officer discovers her secret, he uncovers a shocking truth that changes everything. What happens next will break your heart and leave you questioning how far we've truly come. Will he be able to save her in time? Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you love this story, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an update. It was a cold night in Oakland, California. The kind of night that crept into your bones and made you shiver even through layers of clothing. The winter chill had come unexpectedly early this year, catching the city off guard as temperatures dipped lower than usual, casting an icy pall over the streets. In the shadows of Maple Park, one of the city's most overlooked green spaces, a small figure huddled on a bench, trying to make herself small enough to avoid being noticed. Zuri, a 4-year-old girl, lay curled under a thin blanket, clutching a small plastic bag close to her chest. Her tiny frame barely registered against the dark shadows cast by the surrounding trees. The lights from the nearby luxury apartments flickered in the distance, their warmth a stark contrast to the cold that gripped the park. The bench she called her bed was far from comfortable, but it was all she had. No one noticed her at first. No one noticed the girl who slept alone night after night, hidden by the hustle of Oakland's busy streets, ignored by the very people who passed by without a second thought. It wasn't until Officer Derek Hayes made his rounds that he saw her. Out of the corner of his eye, on one of those long, lonely patrols he'd been doing since his transfer to Oakland. He had been on the force for more than 15 years, but nothing had prepared him for the hollow emptiness he saw when he glanced at the bench that cold December night. Derek was used to seeing the homeless, but this was different. He stopped his patrol car, his breath fogging up the window as he peered out. There she was, lying there, looking so small and fragile against the vastness of the dark park. Something about her stillness pulled at his heartstrings. He'd seen suffering before, but it was always from a distance, always through the lens of his professional duties. This time it felt personal. He couldn't shake the image of her innocence, her silence. It reminded him of his own daughter, Sarah, who had passed away from leukemia 3 years ago. Derek shook the thought away. He couldn't let his personal grief cloud his judgment. This was his job, after all. Still, he couldn't help but feel a familiar ache, the kind that gnawed at his insides every time he thought about Sarah. As he watched, the girl stirred. Zuri's eyes, wide and alert, flicked up toward the streetlight above her. There was a wisdom in her gaze that was both unsettling and heartbreaking. She wasn't afraid. There was no begging, no crying for help. She simply watched the world pass by, her little body still as the cold winter wind cut through the trees. Derek's heart clenched. He couldn't simply drive away. Not this time. He parked the car and got out, walking slowly toward her, trying not to make a sound. His boots crunched on the frozen ground, and Zuri's eyes shifted toward him, catching the beam of his flashlight. She didn't flinch. Instead, she sat up slightly, holding the plastic bag closer, her expression unreadable. "Hey, little one," Derek said softly, crouching beside her. "What are you doing out here all alone?" Zuri didn't answer. She just watched him, her face serene in the midst of all the chaos around her. For a moment, the world seemed to fall away. There was only her, a tiny soul in a vast, uncaring world. Derek's breath caught in his chest. He knelt lower, offering her a gentle smile. "Are you okay?" Zuri's eyes met his, but she didn't respond. There was something strange about the way she looked at him. She wasn't afraid, but there was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition that words couldn't bridge. Derek's fingers itched to reach out, to comfort her, but he held back. He wasn't sure how to help a child like her. He had seen this kind of thing before. Children living on the streets, ignored by society, left to fend for themselves. But there was something different about this girl. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was something more. His heart thudded against his chest. What had happened to her? Where was her family? Was there anyone who even cared? Before he could act, Zuri suddenly grabbed her plastic bag and, with a speed that seemed unnatural for her age, slid off the bench and darted into the shadows. Derek blinked, stunned for a moment, but then sprang into action. He rushed forward, calling her name. "Wait, wait!" he shouted, but she was already gone, disappearing into the night like a ghost. The next night, Derek couldn't shake the memory of Zuri. Her face lingered in his mind like a distant echo, and he found himself unable to focus on his patrol. What had happened to her? Why was she all alone in that cold, forgotten corner of the city? As he drove past Maple Park again, he couldn't help but glance toward the bench where he had seen her the night before. It was empty now, but the remnants of her presence lingered in the air. Derek's heart sank. He had to find out who she was. He couldn't let her slip away again. After his shift, Derek spent hours searching the city, talking to anyone who might know anything about Zuri. He spoke to local store owners, teachers, and even a few homeless individuals, hoping for any piece of information. But as the hours stretched into the early morning, it became clear that no one knew anything substantial about the little girl who seemed to have disappeared into the shadows of Oakland. It wasn't until Derek spoke with Mrs. Chen, the coffee shop owner who had been working in the area for years, that things began to unfold. She had seen Zuri before, and as Derek listened to her, he realized the depth of what he was dealing with. "She's been here for weeks, officer," Mrs. Chen said, her voice full of concern. "I see her come into the park every night, always the same. Just a little thing, too small to be out there alone, you know. I try to leave her something warm, but she never touches it. She just sits there watching everything like she's waiting for something." Derek's heart ached for Zuri. He asked more questions, but Mrs. Chen didn't have much to offer. She had only seen Zuri in passing, always the same, sitting on the bench wrapped in that thin blanket, her eyes vigilant but distant. As Derek walked away from the coffee shop, his mind raced. What had happened to her? Why was she out there night after night with no one to protect her? He couldn't help but think of his own daughter, Sarah. The pain of losing her to leukemia 3 years ago had never fully left him. Every time Derek passed a child's smiling face or heard the laughter of young voices, his heart tightened with loss. Sarah, with her bright eyes and curious questions about the world, had been ripped away from him too soon. Now this little girl, Zuri, seemed to be reminding him of what he had lost and what he still had the chance to protect. The next day, Derek continued his search. This time he focused on local shelters, hoping someone might know something about Zuri's whereabouts or her mother. He was led to a small, rundown building on the outskirts of the city, a homeless shelter that specialized in helping women and children who had nowhere else to go. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of disinfectant and worn furniture. The receptionist, a weary woman named Helen, looked up from her desk as Derek entered. "Can I help you, officer?" she asked, her voice faintly tired. "I'm looking for a little girl about 4 years old," Derek began. "She's been seen around Maple Park. Her name's Zuri." Helen paused, her brow furrowed. "I think I've seen her file before. She came through here a while back, with her mother, Kiana." Derek's heart skipped a beat. He leaned forward, desperate for any information. "What happened to them? Did they stay here?" Helen shook her head. "No, they came in for a night or two, but we couldn't provide the kind of help they needed. Kiana, she's been struggling with addiction. They've been in and out of shelters for months now. We've tried to help, but the system's, well, it's not built to support people like them." Derek's frustration mounted. He had seen the way the system treated those who needed help most, the homeless, the vulnerable, the forgotten. But Zuri wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a child, alone in a world that didn't seem to care. He asked about Kiana, Zuri's mother. Helen explained that Kiana had disappeared again, and there were no recent reports of her. "She's always running. She'll disappear for a while and then come back again. It's like she's lost in a maze she can't get out of." Derek's mind raced. How is it possible for a mother to vanish so completely, leaving her child to fend for herself? He felt the weight of the world on his shoulders as he left the shelter, knowing he had only scratched the surface of the struggles Zuri and her mother faced. Later that night, Derek went back to Maple Park, hoping to catch another glimpse of Zuri. As he drove through the park, he felt a pang of guilt. What was he doing? How could he save a little girl from a world so broken? He wasn't equipped for this. He was just a cop, not a social worker, not a counselor. But as he passed the familiar bench, something inside him snapped. He couldn't walk away. Not this time. He parked the car and walked toward the bench, his breath visible in the night air. There in the same spot was Zuri. She was curled up just as she had been the night before, the thin blanket barely providing any warmth against the biting cold. Her small body barely moved as Derek approached. She seemed to sense his presence before he even spoke, her eyes meeting his as he knelt beside her. "Zuri," Derek said softly. "Are you all right?" This time she didn't run away. She simply looked at him as if she knew something he didn't. And in that moment, Derek realized that it wasn't just the system that had failed Zuri. It was the world around her. She had slipped through the cracks unseen and unnoticed, and yet here she was, somehow still surviving. Derek's heart broke for her. He reached out a hand, offering her something, a small piece of comfort in a world that had offered her so little. Derek couldn't stop thinking about Zuri as the days passed. Each night he drove past Maple Park hoping to find her, but she was always gone by the time he arrived. He felt powerless, frustrated. How could a 4-year-old girl disappear into the night so easily? How had she survived on her own for so long? His investigation into Zuri's past led him deeper into the broken system that had failed her, and so many others like her. The more Derek learned, the more he realized that the system wasn't just inadequate, it was actively contributing to the cycle of neglect and abandonment. His pursuit of answers became more than just a job. It became a mission. He had to make things right for Zuri, for all the children who slipped through the cracks unnoticed. Derek's first step was to meet with the staff at Child Protective Services, CPS. He had hoped that they might be able to shed light on Zuri's situation, but what he found there only deepened his frustration. The office was cold, sterile, and disorganized. Files were piled high on the desks, half of them neglected and buried under stacks of paper. Caseworker Rachel Turner, a weary woman in her mid-30s, greeted Derek with a tired smile. "Officer Hayes," she said, sitting down behind a cluttered desk. "What can I do for you today?" "I'm looking for information on a young girl named Zuri," Derek began, his voice calm but insistent. "She's been living on the streets, and I'm concerned about her welfare." Rachel sighed, rubbing her temples. "Zuri, yeah, we have a file on her, but I can tell you right now there's not much we can do. Her mom, Kiana, comes in now and then, but we've had trouble reaching them. The system is stretched too thin. We don't have the resources to keep track of every single case, and Kiana, she's not exactly cooperative." Derek leaned in, his frustration evident. "So you just let her slip through the cracks?" Rachel hesitated. She knew it was true, but she didn't want to admit it. The truth was, CPS was overrun, social workers were overloaded, and there was simply no way to keep up with the flood of cases. Children like Zuri were forgotten, lost in a maze of paperwork and bureaucracy. "We try our best," Rachel said quietly, "but there are hundreds of cases like hers. We can't save them all." Derek shook his head, feeling a surge of anger. "How can you call this trying your best?" He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You're supposed to protect these kids, and you're not doing it." Rachel didn't answer. Instead, she lowered her gaze, ashamed. The more Derek learned, the clearer it became. The child welfare system was failing. It wasn't just neglecting children like Zuri. It was actively turning a blind eye to them, treating them as numbers, as paperwork, rather than as lives. The overworked caseworkers were barely able to keep up with their caseloads, much less actually help the families in need. And the underfunded shelters, those were overcrowded and struggling to provide any real support. Derek's investigation didn't stop there. He started speaking to people in the community, reaching out to local advocates and nonprofits. He spoke to activists who had been fighting for years to address the flaws in the system, but they too were fighting an uphill battle. One evening, Derek sat down with Lena Foster, a local activist who had spent years advocating for the homeless and working with children in foster care. Lena had seen the ugly truth of the system firsthand. She had spent her career trying to shine a light on the corruption and neglect that existed within child services. "They don't care about these kids, Derek," Lena said, her voice sharp with anger. It's not just about a lack of resources, it's a complete disregard for their lives. They're viewed as disposable, just another statistic in a broken system that has no intention of changing. Derek listened in silence, the weight of her words sinking in. They're supposed to protect these kids, but instead they sweep them under the rug. They don't want to face the truth because it would mean admitting that they're failing. And if they admit that, they'd have to do something about it. And they don't want to. As Derek left Lena's office that evening, he felt a growing sense of urgency. Zuri and all the children like her had been abandoned by the system. The people meant to protect them weren't doing their jobs, and the community had long since stopped noticing. They had become invisible, pushed to the margins of society where no one cared enough to look. Derek knew that he couldn't let it go. He couldn't walk away and pretend that everything would fix itself. Zuri needed him, and he couldn't turn his back on her, not now. Later that night, Derek found himself back at Maple Park, once again searching for any sign of Zuri. The park was empty, save for the faint sound of rustling leaves. The streets surrounding it were quiet, almost eerily so. Derek parked his car at the edge of the park, his headlights casting long shadows over the benches and walkways. He got out and began walking, his footsteps crunching softly on the frozen ground. As he passed by the same bench where Zuri had been the night before, his eyes scanned the area. He didn't expect to find her, but something inside him refused to give up hope. He walked around the park for a while, searching the dark corners, peering into the shadows. And then there she was, Zuri curled up in a small ball, fast asleep on the bench. She had managed to find a small scrap of cardboard to lie on, her thin blanket wrapped tightly around her body. Derek felt his heart break again. He had tried so hard to help, and yet here she was, still out in the cold, still alone. This was the reality of so many children, forgotten, overlooked, left to survive in a world that didn't care. But Derek couldn't let that be Zuri's future, not if he could help it. As he watched her, a new resolve began to form in his mind. He wasn't going to let the system continue to fail. He wasn't going to stand by and do nothing. He had to find a way to get Zuri the help she needed, and that meant confronting the system that had failed her, no matter how difficult or dangerous that might be. The cold had crept in deeper that night, the frost lingering like a cruel reminder of the city's indifference. Derek stood in the shadows of Maple Park, watching Zuri as she slept on the same bench. The park, usually filled with the hustle and bustle of people in the daylight, felt eerily still now, its benches empty and its pathways silent. But not for Zuri. She had claimed the bench as her own, and there she was, curled in on herself, a tiny figure against the expanse of the park's cold concrete. As Derek stood there, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for her. She was so small, so fragile, yet there was something about her resilience that stopped him cold. Zuri wasn't crying. She wasn't begging for help. She had learned to survive in the shadows, unnoticed by the rest of the world. He had seen kids on the streets before, children abandoned by their families or the system, but something about Zuri was different. It wasn't just her circumstance that struck him. It was the quiet strength she radiated. Derek had witnessed the most vulnerable in society crumble, but Zuri, despite her age, seemed to possess a survival instinct that surpassed most adults. Derek crouched down beside her, careful not to wake her. He didn't want to startle her, but his eyes studied her closely. The small plastic bag she always carried was clutched tightly in her arms, like a lifeline. Her thin blanket barely kept the chill at bay, but Zuri lay still, her body curled into a tight ball. Her tiny fingers poked out from the blanket, turning a faint blue from the cold, yet she didn't shiver. Her eyes, closed in deep sleep, betrayed none of the exhaustion that Derek knew she must have felt. Instead, there was something peaceful about her, almost as if this was the only world she knew. Derek watched for a moment, trying to understand what made Zuri tick. How could she be so at ease in such a cold, unwelcoming world? His mind wandered back to his own daughter, Sarah. He had been unable to protect her. He had tried everything to save her, but the illness had taken her anyway. Yet here was Zuri, fighting to survive every night with no one looking out for her. And she had done it without so much as a cry. Her resilience was something Derek had never expected to see in such a young child. Despite the darkness of her situation, despite the cold and the hunger, Zuri had managed to stay strong. She was a survivor, one of the few who could make it in a world that had turned its back on her. And Derek couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration for her. This was a child who had been failed by the system in every conceivable way, but somehow she still had the strength to stand up every day and face a world that didn't seem to care. Zuri stirred in her sleep, her small hands gripping the plastic bag tighter. Derek's heart clenched. He couldn't just leave her here like this. He had to do something. He couldn't bear the thought of Zuri slipping further into the cracks of a system that had already failed so many others. The next morning, Derek returned to the park, determined to find Zuri's mother. He knew that Kiana, Zuri's mother, was struggling with addiction, and the system had done little to help her. But if he could find her, he could at least give Zuri the chance she needed. The more Derek learned about Kiana, the more he realized that Zuri's survival wasn't just a product of luck. It was because of her mother's love, even if that love was imperfect. He spoke to people in the neighborhood asking about Kiana and her whereabouts. He was met with reluctant answers. Most people knew about Kiana's addiction but didn't know much else. Still, Derek persisted. He couldn't shake the image of Zuri's face, the way she looked at him with that quiet wisdom. It was as if she knew more than she should for someone so young. There had to be someone who could tell him where to find her. Hours later, Derek's search led him to a small shelter in the downtown area. The shelter wasn't much, just a rundown building tucked between two larger, more well-kept structures. But it was a lifeline for people like Kiana and Zuri, a place where they could find temporary refuge. The woman at the front desk, Helen, greeted him with a weary smile. "I remember Zuri and Kiana," Helen said after a brief conversation. "Kiana came here a while back, but she's gone again. I don't know where they went. She didn't want to stay long. She's been in and out of shelters for months." Derek felt a knot tighten in his chest. "Where do they go when they leave?" Helen shrugged. "I don't know. Kiana's hard to keep track of. She comes in, gets help, then leaves when she feels better. But she's never been able to stay clean for long. The addiction, it pulls her back in. And Zuri, she's been with her the whole time." Derek nodded, his mind racing. This was what he had expected, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. Zuri's resilience was even more impressive when considering the instability she lived with every day. But this life wasn't sustainable. Eventually, Zuri's strength would wear out. It had to. Derek left the shelter, feeling more determined than ever. He couldn't leave Zuri to fend for herself, not while there were people who could help. He needed to find a way to get her into a stable home, a place where she could be safe, loved, and given the chance to grow into the remarkable person she was capable of becoming. But Derek knew that the real challenge wasn't just about finding Zuri a home. It was about taking on the system, a system that had let children like Zuri fall through the cracks. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. But Derek was ready. He owed it to Zuri, and he owed it to himself. He wasn't going to let her face this world alone anymore. Derek sat in his car long after his shift had ended, staring blankly at the steering wheel. The park had been quiet again. No sign of Zuri, no hint of where she might be. But it wasn't just the absence of the little girl that gnawed at him. It was the growing sense of helplessness, the feeling that no matter how much he tried, he couldn't fix the system that had failed her. He could rescue a child, but what good would that do if the world she lived in remained the same? His thoughts were interrupted by the familiar hum of his phone vibrating in his pocket. He pulled it out, seeing a text from Marie, his wife. Her words were simple, but they hit him with the weight of everything he had been avoiding. "I miss you. You've been distant lately. Please come home." He sighed, rubbing his face with both hands. Marie had been his anchor through the darkest parts of his life, especially after Sarah's death. When the daughter passed away from leukemia 3 years ago, it shattered something deep within Derek. It took him months to even step back into a police car, let alone continue his work. But Marie had been his support, pushing him to keep going, even when he thought he had nothing left to give. Still, he couldn't shake the guilt that weighed on him. Since moving to Oakland, he had buried himself in his work. He couldn't bring himself to let go of the case, to stop looking for Zuri, even though it felt like he was chasing shadows. He had poured so much of himself into this investigation, so much of the grief he'd been holding on to since losing Sarah, that it was becoming harder to separate the two. Derek glanced at the photo of Sarah on his dashboard, her bright eyes smiling back at him from a time that felt both so distant and so painfully recent. He remembered the way she would light up when he came home after a long day, her laughter filling the house. It was a sound he would never hear again. His eyes burned with unshed tears, the weight of Sarah's absence a constant ache in his chest. Zuri had brought that grief flooding back, the memories of his daughter, the endless what-ifs, the unspoken fears that he would never be able to protect another child again. But Zuri was different. She wasn't his daughter, but in many ways, she felt like the daughter he could never save. It wasn't just the injustice of her situation. It was the haunting reminder that no matter how much love he poured into his job, there were so many more like her, lost in the cracks of a system that didn't care. And that realization nearly broke him. The next day, Derek decided to take a different approach. He couldn't keep drowning in his own grief. Zuri needed him, and he couldn't afford to let his emotions get in the way anymore. Marie's words echoed in his mind, a reminder that he couldn't shut himself off from the people who loved him. He had to find a balance, for his own sake as well as for Zuri's. He started with Kiana, Zuri's mother. The shelters had no leads, and the social services were as useless as ever, their case files nothing but a jumble of missed opportunities and bureaucratic failure. But Kiana's sister, Grace, had become the next piece of the puzzle. Grace had been living on the fringes of the system, surviving the same hardships as her sister, but with a resilience that Zuri seemed to have inherited. Derek met with Grace in the late afternoon, sitting in a small cafe tucked away on the quieter side of Oakland. She was older than Kiana by a few years, a woman whose tired eyes spoke of a past full of secrets and struggles. She had seen too much of the broken foster care system and too many of her family members lost to it. But it was her quiet, almost stoic demeanor that told Derek there was more beneath the surface. Grace sipped her coffee, glancing over at Derek, as if sizing him up. She didn't trust easily. Derek had learned quickly that people who had been through the system didn't trust easily, especially when it came to those who represented the authority that had failed them. "I know why you're here," Grace said, her voice low but firm. "You're looking for Zuri, and I don't blame you, but you need to understand, Derek. Zuri's situation isn't simple." Derek nodded, leaning forward. I know she's been through a lot, but I have to help her. I can't just let her keep living like this." Grace looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. "It's not that easy. Kiana, she's caught up in something bigger, something that's been going on for years. Zuri is caught in the middle of it, and I've tried to keep her safe, but I'm not enough. The system doesn't care about people like us." Derek's heart sank. He had suspected as much. Kiana's addiction was just the surface of a deeper systemic problem that involved foster care corruption and the way vulnerable children were treated by the state. "I want to help," Derek said, his voice raw. "But I need to understand what's really going on. What's the story with Zuri? How did she end up on the streets?" Grace set her cup down and looked out the window. For a moment it was as if she was lost in the past, her eyes clouded with memories that were too painful to revisit. "Zuri's been with me for a while," she said softly. "Kiana, she's been in and out of rehab, in and out of shelters, but every time she gets clean, the system pushes her back out. They think Kiana's a lost cause, and Zuri, she's just a casualty. I'm the one who's been trying to keep her safe, but Zuri's never had a real chance to be a kid. She's had to grow up too fast." Derek's chest tightened. He had seen it before, the tragic reality that too many children faced, forced to survive on their own in a world that hadn't prepared them for anything. He could feel the weight of Grace's words, the haunting truth of Zuri's lost childhood. "This system," Grace continued, her voice quivering with emotion, "it doesn't protect people like Zuri. It pushes them away and leaves them to fend for themselves. And every time they do, they just get swallowed up. Zuri, She's stronger than most adults, but that doesn't make her any less alone. Derek took a deep breath, the reality of their situation settling heavily on his shoulders. He hadn't fully understood the extent of the corruption, the failures, but now he saw the truth in Grace's eyes, and he knew that he couldn't turn back. He wasn't just trying to save Zuri anymore. He was trying to fight a broken system that had caused too many families to suffer. The weight of Grace's words lingered in Derek's mind as he left the cafe. He couldn't shake the feeling that Zuri's story was more than just the result of an absent mother or a failed system. There was something deeper, something hidden in the silence. The more Derek thought about it, the more he realized that Zuri, this brave little girl, wasn't just surviving in the streets by chance. She had been part of something bigger. But what, and why was she so far removed from help? The following day, Derek began digging into the details of Kiana's life and Zuri's past. He knew that if he was going to help them, he needed to uncover the truth. He couldn't rely on the flawed records and incomplete files from child services. They were too tainted by neglect. He had to find the hidden stories, the ones that people like Zuri and Kiana had been forced to bury just to survive. Derek visited the local hospital, where he was able to pull up records of Kiana's visits over the past year. He learned that Kiana had been admitted multiple times, often for overdoses, but there was one detail that caught his attention. Zuri had been seen with her during several of those visits. The child had never been officially listed as a patient, but the staff remembered her. Small, quiet, always clinging to her mother's side, looking far older than her age. It wasn't the first time Derek had encountered children in similar situations, but it still stung. No one had taken a closer look. Zuri's life, her suffering, had been ignored by a system that was too busy pushing paper and making excuses. But something about the pattern of visits stood out to him. It was as if the hospital knew something more, but no one had connected the dots. In a determined effort to uncover more, Derek turned to Lena Foster, the activist he had met earlier. She was one of the few people who wasn't afraid to speak the truth, even when the consequences were high. After explaining what he had uncovered, Lena agreed to help him access a few more records that were hidden deeper in the system, those that the social workers had been too afraid to file away or perhaps even chose to ignore. When they met later that afternoon, Lena handed Derek a stack of papers. "I've been trying to dig into the foster care system for years," she said, her voice low and urgent. "I've come across a few disturbing things. Kiana's case is one of them. But it's not just her. There's a whole network of children falling through the cracks, and I've been trying to trace where they're going." Derek scanned the files quickly, his heart racing. It was worse than he thought. These children, some of them like Zuri, were placed with families who had no real capacity to care for them, while others were being used for illegal activities, treated like pawns in a larger, darker game. "They're trafficking these kids, Derek," Lena said quietly, her voice shaking with the weight of the truth. "They've been taking children from the system, finding ways to make them disappear, just like they did with Zuri." Derek felt his stomach drop. The realization hit him like a wave. Zuri wasn't just another forgotten child of a broken system. She had been part of something much more sinister. A criminal network had been using vulnerable children as tools, taking them from the foster care system, exploiting their innocence for reasons no child should ever have to face. Lena pointed to a name on one of the documents. Grace Lee, Zuri's mother's sister. Derek froze. What does she have to do with this? Lena's eyes widened, her voice barely above a whisper. "Grace, she's been working undercover for years, trying to expose the corruption within the system. But she's deep inside it, Derek. She's been caught up in the same thing that's been destroying the lives of these kids." Derek's mind raced. Grace, the very person who had been helping Zuri, had been hiding her true involvement with a network that was exploiting children like Zuri all along. He wasn't sure what this meant for their investigation, but one thing was clear. Zuri had been caught in a web of deception, and it was a lot bigger than he had imagined. The next step was to confront Grace. Derek had to find out the full extent of her involvement, even if it meant facing the painful reality of how deep this corruption ran. But before he could reach out to her, he received an unexpected phone call. It was from Mrs. Chen, the coffee shop owner. Her voice was shaky, almost panicked. "Officer Hayes," she said, "you need to come quickly. Zuri, I saw her again, but this time something was different. She's with someone. And they're not just anyone, Derek. These people, they're dangerous." Derek's heart skipped a beat. He immediately hung up the phone and sped toward Mrs. Chen's coffee shop. The sight that awaited him there was enough to make his blood run cold. Zuri, the small, resilient child he had come to care for, was standing by the counter, holding that same familiar plastic bag. But this time, there was a man with her, a man who was far too well dressed for the streets of Oakland. His cold, calculating eyes met Derek's as he approached. Zuri didn't look up. Her gaze was fixed on the man's hand where she clutched a small envelope. She didn't seem scared, but there was something guarded about the way she held herself. As Derek stepped closer, the man's face tightened, his expression darkening. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked, his voice low and menacing. Derek didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze shifted to Zuri. There was something in her eyes, a quiet understanding. She knew exactly who this man was, and she knew exactly why he was there. Derek had found a clue, and with it, the key to uncovering the truth. Derek's heart raced as he stood in the doorway of Mrs. Chen's coffee shop, his gaze locked on the man standing with Zuri. His mind was whirling. This wasn't just some random person. It was clear from the way the man carried himself, from the icy, calculating look in his eyes, that he was involved in something far deeper than Derek could have imagined. Zuri was there, holding onto that plastic bag, her small hands clutching it protectively, as if it were her only lifeline. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man repeated, his voice cold and controlled. Derek took a slow, steady breath, trying to keep his composure. He couldn't afford to let his emotions dictate his next move. He needed information, and he needed to get it without tipping his hand too early. "Nothing I can't handle," Derek said finally, his voice steady but his mind working quickly. He stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the man. Zuri still hadn't spoken, her eyes not meeting his. She seemed resigned, almost as if she had accepted this strange, dangerous encounter as a part of her reality. It made Derek's blood run cold. "Where's she going?" Derek asked, trying to keep his tone casual, probing. "I haven't seen her around much lately. She's been difficult to keep track of." The man's lips curled into a tight smile. "Zuri knows her way around," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "She's no stranger to the streets. We're just keeping her company." Derek's instinct screamed that something wasn't right. The man wasn't being honest, but Derek couldn't afford to push too hard, not with Zuri standing there so vulnerable and silent. He needed to get to the bottom of this. Who was this man, and why was Zuri with him? Before Derek could ask another question, Zuri suddenly looked up at him, her eyes filled with something that made his stomach churn, an emotion that Derek could only describe as a knowing. It wasn't fear, but it was a kind of silent acceptance, as if she had already made peace with the life she had been forced to lead. Derek's heart clenched. He stepped closer to her, his voice soft. "Zuri, is everything okay?" For the first time since Derek had met her, Zuri spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it was clear. "They're going to help me," she said, her eyes flicking toward the man, and then back to Derek. "They promised." Derek's chest tightened. What did she mean by that? Who had promised her anything? And what kind of help was this man offering? It didn't make sense, and the more Derek thought about it, the more dangerous it seemed. Before he could respond, the man's expression darkened. "That's enough," he said, his voice now carrying a warning. "I think it's time for you to go, officer. We don't want any trouble." The way the man spoke was more than a threat. It was a command. Derek hesitated, weighing his options. He could force the issue, arrest the man, but that would mean putting Zuri at risk. He could see the fear flickering in her eyes. She didn't want to be caught in the middle of this, didn't want the man to get angry. And so Derek did the one thing he hadn't expected to do. He stepped back. "I'll be back," Derek said, his voice firm but not confrontational. He needed time to figure out who the man was, what this help was about, and why Zuri was so clearly tied up in it. But one thing was certain. He couldn't just walk away from this now. As Derek turned to leave, he felt Zuri's eyes on his back. There was something in her gaze, a silent plea, a wish for help, even if she couldn't fully articulate it. It was a look that made Derek's resolve harden. The next few days were a blur for Derek. He kept a low profile, watching from the shadows, waiting for another chance to find out who the man with Zuri really was. He knew he couldn't rush in blindly, but the more he thought about the situation, the more he realized that Zuri wasn't just some helpless child. She was involved in something much larger than he had originally thought. He spent hours poring over records, speaking to more people in the community, trying to piece together the fragmented picture of Zuri's life. It wasn't until he received an unexpected phone call from Lena Foster, the activist, that the first real lead came his way. "Derek," Lena said, her voice urgent, "I found something. It's about the man you met at the coffee shop. His name is Jonas Vance. He's been tied to some human trafficking operations in the area. I'm not sure how it's all connected, but I think Zuri's caught in the middle of it." Derek felt his pulse quicken. Human trafficking? But Zuri, she's just a little girl. What does she have to do with something like that? "I don't have all the answers yet, but I know she's being used. Jonas Vance and his associates, they have their fingers in a lot of illegal activities, and the way Zuri's been acting, I think she's been manipulated. She's part of something far darker than we first thought." Derek's stomach churned. This was the truth he had been afraid to find. Zuri was caught up in a web of exploitation, being used by a man who was far more dangerous than Derek had first realized. "I'm going after him," Derek said, his voice cold with determination. "I need your help." Lena agreed without hesitation. "We'll need to be careful. These people don't play by the rules, but together, we might have a chance." The next few days saw Derek and Lena working in tandem, collecting evidence, connecting the dots. They discovered more about Jonas Vance's operations, uncovering the extent of his involvement in the illegal trafficking of children. But as the pieces fell into place, they knew that Zuri was at the center of this operation. Derek couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. Zuri, the little girl who had been so quiet and strong, was now a key player in a much larger and far more dangerous world. She had survived so far, but how much longer could she last? As the plan to confront Jonas Vance began to take shape, Derek realized that he wasn't just chasing a criminal. He was fighting for Zuri's future and for every other child who had been pulled into this dark underworld. And with the help of an unlikely ally, Lena Foster, a woman who knew the system's flaws better than anyone, Derek was more determined than ever to bring Zuri home. The days leading up to the operation were filled with tension. Derek and Lena worked tirelessly, piecing together fragments of information, tracking Jonas Vance's every move. They were no longer working in the shadows. They were preparing to expose the ugly truth of the system that had failed Zuri and so many others. Every piece of evidence they uncovered felt like a small victory, but none of it was enough to bring down Vance. Not yet. Derek's thoughts were consumed by Zuri. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her. Her eyes filled with that silent wisdom, that resilience that was beyond her years. She had been through more than any child should endure, and yet she had found a way to survive. But now, as the operation drew closer, Derek's guilt weighed heavily on him. He couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, he had waited too long. He had failed to protect her sooner. Could he fix this? Could he undo the damage done to Zuri's childhood and give her the future she deserved? He wasn't sure, but he was about to try. The plan was simple but dangerous. Lena had managed to uncover the location of one of Vance's safe houses, a warehouse on the outskirts of Oakland. The place was heavily guarded, but it was also where the children were being kept before being moved to other locations. This was their opportunity. With a team of trusted officers and some undercover support from Lena's network, Derek would infiltrate the compound, get Zuri out, and shut down the operation once and for all. It was a risk. Zuri was still caught in the middle of this twisted game, and no one knew exactly how Jonas Vance would react when the walls finally came crashing down. Derek stood in the parking lot, his breath visible in the cold night air. The operation was set to begin in less than an hour. He had double-checked every detail, gone over the plan a dozen times, but there was still a part of him that couldn't shake the fear that they would be too late. Zuri was out there somewhere in the hands of people who treated her like a commodity. But she wasn't just another child to him. She was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, of everything he had failed to protect. He had to save her. He ran a hand through his hair and turned to Lena, who had been his anchor through it all. She was calm, focused. She had always been a fighter, but tonight she was more than that. She was determined, and for the first time in days, Derek allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. "Ready?" he asked. Lena nodded. "As ready as we'll ever be. We've got one shot at this, Derek. There's no turning back." Derek met her gaze, his voice steady. "I'm not turning back. Not this time." The warehouse loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the night sky. As Derek and his team approached, they split into smaller groups to surround the building. Derek's heart pounded in his chest as he adjusted the earpiece in his ear, listening to Lena's voice through the static. "We've got eyes on the entrance," Lena said, her voice sharp. "Everything looks clear for now." Derek nodded, his grip tightening on his flashlight. They had to be swift. Any delay could jeopardize the operation. His team moved silently, each officer taking their position as planned. The seconds seemed to stretch into eternity as Derek waited for the signal. Then, the voice of the officer in charge crackled in his earpiece. "Go." Everything moved at once. Derek's team burst into action, their movements fluid and practiced. They entered the building in a well-coordinated sweep, moving quickly to avoid detection. The air inside was damp and musty, the smell of old metal and concrete heavy in their lungs. The noise of their boots echoed in the large, empty space as they advanced deeper into the warehouse. Derek's mind was focused only on one thing: finding Zuri. He could feel his pulse quicken as they reached the area where the children were being held. This was it. They were so close. He heard voices ahead, loud, aggressive. It was clear that the traffickers were still on guard, unaware that their operation was about to be shut down. Derek's heart skipped a beat. What if Zuri was among them? What if she was hiding, scared? He couldn't bear the thought of her being anywhere near these people. They reached the back of the warehouse, and the scene in front of them was almost too much to bear. Children, some as young as 5 or 6, were crammed into makeshift cages, their eyes wide with fear. Some were asleep, exhausted from the long days of exploitation they had endured. Others were crying softly, too afraid to speak. Derek's stomach turned, and then he saw her. Zuri was standing in the corner, her face pale and drawn. She was alone, but her eyes locked with Derek's, and for a brief moment, everything else in the world faded away. She was alive. She was here. But she wasn't alone for long. Jonas Vance appeared from the shadows, his eyes narrowing when he saw Derek. The calm, controlled man from the coffee shop was gone. In his place stood a man who was furious, his hands clenched into fists, and he moved towards Derek with a purposeful stride. "You should have stayed away," Vance spat, his voice low and dangerous. "This isn't your fight." Derek didn't flinch. "It is now." Vance's hand reached for a gun at his waist, but before he could draw it, Lena's team moved in. There was a blur of motion as the officers tackled Vance to the ground, restraining him in seconds. Derek couldn't help but feel a surge of relief. They had him. And then, as if on cue, Zuri took a hesitant step forward. She was shaking, but her voice was clear. "You came for me," she said softly, her eyes filled with something that resembled both gratitude and sadness. Derek kneeled in front of her, taking her small hand in his. "I promised you I would," he said, his voice thick with emotion. And in that moment, Derek knew that this fight, this victory, was just the beginning. Zuri was safe, for now, but the fight for her future and the futures of children like her was far from over. The weeks that followed Jonas Vance's arrest were a whirlwind of emotions, revelations, and changes. The case against him was solid, and with his capture, Zuri had been rescued from the clutches of a criminal network that had used her innocence as a commodity. Derek stood by her side through it all, watching her slowly begin to heal, Though he knew that the road ahead would not be easy. Zuri had been placed in a new foster home, one far removed from the trauma she had experienced. This time, the foster family wasn't part of the broken system that had failed her before. The family was kind, and they had been through training to help children like Zuri, children who had endured more than any child should have to face. Derek knew that Zuri had a long way to go before she could fully trust anyone again, but for the first time in a long while, he saw something in her eyes that made him believe that healing was possible. Derek had spent every moment he could with Zuri, helping her adjust to her new life, guiding her through the terrifying uncertainties of starting over. He would sit with her at the kitchen table, talking to her, answering her questions about the world and reassuring her that she was safe. He had seen the scars that Zuri's silence had left on her soul, but he was determined to be there for her in whatever way she needed. But it wasn't just Zuri who was healing. Derek himself had found a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. For so long, he had been haunted by the death of his own daughter, Sarah. The loss had consumed him, pushing him deeper into his work, to the point where he had almost forgotten what it felt like to truly live. He had buried his pain, pretending that saving other children could make up for the loss of his own. But as he stood beside Zuri, helping her rebuild her life, Derek realized something. He wasn't just saving her, he was healing too. He hadn't been able to save Sarah, but he could save Zuri. And in doing so, he had found a sense of redemption. For the first time, Derek didn't feel the crushing weight of his grief. Instead, he felt like a father again, like a protector who had done something good in a world that often felt full of darkness. It wasn't just Derek who had found healing in the aftermath of everything that had happened. Grace, Zuri's aunt, had also begun the slow process of redemption. She had played a key role in exposing the deeper corruption within the foster care system, and now she was working with organizations to help children like Zuri, making sure they didn't slip through the cracks as her own sister had. Grace had been on the fringes of the very system that had exploited her family, but now she was working to change it. "I never thought I could make things right," Grace said one evening, her voice full of quiet determination. "But this is the chance I have to make amends. Zuri needs to know that she's not just a product of the system. She's a person with a future, and that future doesn't have to be decided for her by people who don't care." Derek listened as Grace spoke, his heart swelling with pride. She had taken the hard road, the path toward redemption that was filled with obstacles and shame. But she had chosen it, just as he had chosen to step in and help Zuri. And it made all the difference. The final piece of the puzzle came when Jonas Vance's network was dismantled. With his arrest and the subsequent investigation, more names came to light, and the scale of his operation became fully known. The authorities were able to rescue more children, many of whom had been trafficked, exploited, or lost in the system for years. It was a long, painful process, but it was a process that gave Derek hope. There were still good people in the world, people who cared, who were willing to stand up and make a difference. The closure that followed was bittersweet. For Zuri, it meant that she would be able to build a future that wasn't tainted by fear. She would grow up free from the shadows of exploitation, free from the dark past that had haunted her every step. But the scars would always remain, and that was something Zuri would have to learn to carry. Derek stood outside the courthouse, watching as the final moments of the trial unfolded. It wasn't a victory that filled his chest with pride. It was a sense of peace. There would be no more chasing shadows, no more fighting a system that didn't care. Zuri had found a new family, a new life, and she was finally free. As Derek watched her play in the distance, laughing with her new foster parents, he felt something inside him shift. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not just for Zuri, but for himself as well. Zuri's story wasn't just one of survival. It was a story of resilience, of love conquering the darkest of times. And Derek knew that as long as he could, he would do everything in his power to make sure that Zuri never had to face that darkness alone again. They had both been through unimaginable pain, but in the end, they had found each other. And that was enough to start anew. Together, they had begun to heal. The months that followed marked a turning point in Zuri's life. Her days were no longer consumed by the fear and uncertainty that had once defined her existence. She woke up every morning in a new home, one where she was loved, cherished, and most importantly, safe. Derek couldn't help but watch from the sidelines with a quiet sense of pride. He had fought for Zuri's freedom, but now he saw the strength within her that he hadn't fully recognized before. Zuri was not just a survivor of her circumstances. She was a fighter, a child who had endured more than most people would ever understand, yet had never lost her spark. And with every passing day, that spark grew brighter. She was beginning to trust again, to laugh again, and to be a child again, a child who could dream of a future untainted by the shadows of her past. As Derek continued his work with the police, he found himself spending more and more time at Zuri's new home, helping her adjust to a life that didn't include fear and uncertainty. Every weekend he would visit, often bringing her new books, art supplies, or small toys. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show her that she wasn't alone anymore, that someone cared. One afternoon, as Derek sat in the living room of the house watching Zuri work on a drawing with intense focus, he couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. The little girl who had once been a ghost, a child lost in the system, was now creating something of her own. She was not defined by her past. Instead, she was learning to define herself on her own terms. "Hey, Zuri," Derek called softly, drawing her attention away from the paper. "That's a really nice drawing. What's it about?" Zuri looked up, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. For a moment, her eyes were full of the uncertainty that had marked her childhood, but it quickly faded into something stronger. She held up the paper, showing Derek the picture she had drawn. It was a house, a family, and a garden full of flowers. The colors were bright, cheerful, a stark contrast to the muted tones of the past she had lived through. "I want to live in a house like this," Zuri said, her voice quiet but sure, "where I can grow flowers, and there's always someone to tell me I'm doing okay." Derek's heart swelled as he looked at her drawing. He could see the hope in her eyes, the desire for a future that was filled with the kind of love and security that every child deserved. "You will, Zuri," Derek said, his voice thick with emotion. "You'll have everything you deserve, a home, a family, a life filled with love." The transition from a life on the streets to a home filled with love and support wasn't easy. There were days when Zuri struggled with old memories, flashes of the fear and pain she had buried deep inside. But she was learning how to cope. She had learned that the love she had been missing for so long wasn't just a fleeting dream. It was something real, something that could heal the scars of her past. The new foster parents, a kind couple who had opened their hearts to Zuri, had been a huge part of her healing. They understood her needs, and they were patient, never pushing her too hard, but always there when she needed them. They gave her space, but also encouraged her to open up. Slowly, Zuri began to see that she could trust them, that she could be loved without fear of rejection or betrayal. And it wasn't just Zuri who had experienced this shift. Grace, her aunt, had found a new sense of purpose, dedicating herself to helping children like Zuri, those who had been lost and overlooked. She had begun working with several organizations that focused on giving children in foster care the resources they needed to rebuild their lives. She knew that she couldn't undo the damage that had been done to her family, but she was determined to make sure other children wouldn't have to endure the same fate. As for Derek, his life had also changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. The work he did with Zuri, helping her find her way to a new life, had brought him a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. His role in her healing process had allowed him to begin healing his own wounds that had been left raw after Sarah's death. In some ways, helping Zuri had given him the redemption he had been unknowingly seeking all along. He wasn't a perfect man, but he was doing the best he could, and that was enough. One day, as Derek sat with Zuri and her new parents in their small but cozy living room, he watched the little girl play with her new toys, her laughter filling the air. He knew that this was a moment of peace, a moment where everything felt right. It had been a long road to get here, but they had made it. Zuri's voice broke through his thoughts. She was sitting on the floor, her drawing of the house in front of her, She looked up at Derek and smiled. "Do you think I could really have a house like this one day?" she asked, her voice tentative, as if she wasn't sure if the question was too much to ask. Derek smiled back, his heart full. "I know you will," he said, his voice steady with certainty. "I know you will. You've got everything it takes to make that happen." As he spoke, Zuri's smile widened, the kind of smile that had been absent from her face for so long. Hope and optimism filled her eyes, and Derek knew that despite everything she had been through, she was finally free to be the little girl she was always meant to be. And in that moment, Derek realized that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the belief that their future can be different, that they don't have to be defined by their past. Zuri's journey had been filled with pain, but it was also filled with redemption and resilience. Now, with Derek's help and the love of her new family, she had the opportunity to create a future filled with everything she had been denied before: love, peace, and a place where she truly belonged. The future was bright, and for the first time in a long time, it was her future, not just something forced upon her.